What's up, fellas, and welcome to another episode of Rewriting History with me, the Goob. This is a pretty exciting episode I've gathered an absolute ton of information that I think very seriously and significantly rewrites the narrative, at least for ancient Egypt. The goal of this show is rewriting history, and I've discussed long ago about how, I don't necessarily have a better framework to replace the currently very broken mainstream narrative that exists. And so, despite disagreeing so heavily with the mainstream narrative and thinking it is broken to the point of needing full replacement, I didn't have those foundational blocks to, actually build something new. And I think we're starting to get there. We're really starting to get there. So I'm excited to present this. It is an absolutely overwhelming amount of information. I know that there's just too much to fit into this one episode, and I will likely miss a lot of things. So I'm definitely going to have to revisit this at a later time. But I think I've collected enough evidence to present a pretty strong case that the missing civilization that so many people have been looking for in Egypt is been hidden in plain sight the entire time, and it is the pre-dynastic Egyptians. This started for me with the vases, and I know a lot of people got tired of me talking about the vases, but it's because of the larger implications that they hold. And again, I didn't have all the pieces, but have finally started gathering them, and there are some really big implications with all of this information. I don't even know where to start because it is such an overwhelming amount of information. I think we'll just start with some newly established facts. The vases clearly show rotational technology, lathes, right? Lathes that do not exist in early dynastic Egypt. And this is far from the only example of technology that the pre-dynastics achieved that the dynastics couldn't replicate for hundreds or even 1,000+ years later. The interior of the vases clearly do show lathe technology, but beyond that, there's very clear indications that the lathes were industrially produced. I had a bunch of tech issues right before the show started, so hopefully I'm able to get my presentation together here. I'm looking for the correct link. Here we go. So Stine Gerdes put out a lot of really fantastic analysis on these vases, but this is one of the most important keys right here, which are the axes of rotation that are present in the vases. And there's a lot of consistency to be found within these vases, including these axes of rotation. Each vase from the Petrie Museum has 4 different axes of rotation. One for the top interior of the vase, which is this line right here, which basically just accounts for the tube drill that was used to core out the interior. And then another for the interior of the vase where it's actually being hollowed out. A third for the base of the vase below the handles, and a fourth for the top portion of the vase, handles and above. Along with this, there was also the ellipsoid nature of the base of the exterior of the vase, which isn't present in the top exterior of the vase. The tops are circular, while the base has this very slight ellipsoid. And I mean slight, like it's not detectable by the human eye, but it is consistent and detectable within these scans. And so what does all this mean? I think it very, very strongly indicates a highly industrialized process for creating these vases. You would have one team of people that, roughs out the shape of the vase, right? Just gives you a chunk of rock that's roughly vase shaped. You have another team of people that is coring out with the copper tube drills the interior. A third station where they are actually hollowing out these vases with lathes. Lathes that, again, I've speculated, and we'll get into metallurgy later in this show, but that wood does not account for the level of precision. And I even question whether copper and bronze do, or if iron might be needed, which we have evidence of predynastic iron. But that'll be later. So anyways, you have them core out with a lathe, the interior, and then it goes to the next station where they shape the base of the exterior on one lathe. This lathe had a wobble in it, like Dr. Max Fomichev explained in my interview with him about the vases. You see this ellipsoid nature because there's just a slight imperfection in this lathe. But again, an imperfection so small it's not even detectable by the human eye. So there would be no reason for the predynastics to like fix it, if you will. And then it goes to another station where they lathe out the top of the vase, and then another station where they shape the handles of the vase. They remove that excess material in between, and a final station to polish it. This is not just a guy sitting in a workshop creating these vases. You don't get this level of, consistency across all these vessels when you just have like a singular artisan or multiple artisans, which you definitely have to have a lot of people involved to create the thousands, if not tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of vases produced in this predynastic era. And so you have an assembly line, you have a workshop, you have industrialized processes in these pre-dynastic times, which, much like Göbekli Tepe, people debate whether it's even a proper civilization. But you have this highly industrialized process of creating thousands of very high quality hard stone vases in quality that, again, is not seen for, at minimum, hundreds of years into the dynastic Egyptian period. I'm sure all of you are familiar with how the early dynasties shifted to alabaster, very, very soft stone that can like be scratched with a fingernail even, and clearly have no lathe technology. They're all handmade, right? So you have this loss of technology, this loss of progress from pre-dynastic times to dynastic times. And this is not the only example of that. There's many examples that I'll be covering of what the pre-dynastics were achieving that the dynastics couldn't. Again, there's so much information. It's hard to choose where to go next. So you have, maybe I'll go to Djoser. You have this industrialization of the vases, this mass production of these very high quality hard stone vessels with lathes. And I'm actually going to go to copper next. So you also have pretty recently discovered more evidence of the pre-dynastics producing very high quality copper and bronze, not bronze with tin, but arsenical bronze with very low impurities, and also being produced in very large quantities. Again, something that's not achieved by later dynastic Egyptians for, I want to say, almost 1,000 years. Early dynastic Egyptians were reusing that pre-dynastic copper and bronze, and they were trading for it from other civilizations, but they weren't producing this high quality copper and bronze, and certainly not in large quantities for a very long time after this. And so arsenical bronze, as I was speculating with the vases, I don't think wood is a possibility for the materials to create these lathes. I don't think you see the level of consistency and precision if they were made out of wood. And I don't think copper either. But I think arsenical bronze is entirely plausible to create a lathe that would produce vases like these. But we also have iron production. So there are pre-dynastic meteoric iron beads that have been found. And yes, that is meteoric and it's only some beads. So pretty simple. But then you also have the iron plate that was found in the Great Pyramid. And there's been debate on this in the archaeological circle, and I'm not going to go full into it, but I will say that the currently accepted narrative for this iron plate makes absolutely no sense. In a nutshell, the pyramid was blasted with dynamite, and after blasting the pyramid with dynamite, deep, not like on the surface, but like deep wedged between blocks that were newly exposed by this blast, was this iron plate that was found. And it was analyzed and initially found to match with primitive, iron technology. Like, this certainly wasn't modern iron. This wasn't iron from the age of when the blasting occurred. But the most recently accepted narrative is that, yeah, this was actually modern iron, not from the time of the blasting, but a few hundred years earlier when there was this brief transitional phase in iron production. And somehow that made its way deep into the recesses of this pyramid, unrelated to the blasting. But it's definitely not super ancient. It's definitely not dynastic, and certainly not pre-dynastic or older. It truly makes no sense. I think that this is very clear evidence of iron production, non-meteoric iron production, which is very important here, right? Non-meteoric iron production that at the minimum dates back to the building of the Great Pyramid, but I think predates that. It's probably from pre-dynastic Egypt. And again, all of the copper, all of the bronze, not all of it, because we do find some pre-dynastic copper and bronze, but the vast majority of it, we find evidence of its production. We don't actually find, I think there have been a total of 15 objects found that are pre-dynastic copper and bronze. The evidence that we have that they were creating this is from the byproducts. It's from, river silt and things like that, right? The actual copper and bronze materials, that was almost entirely cannibalized and reused by the later dynastic Egyptians. And so if they were producing iron, which I have more to support the production of iron in pre-dynastic Egypt coming up, it would undeniably be very valuable, very sought after, and would be reused and recycled by the dynastic Egyptians. It's also iron, and iron does not last very long. The desert was not a desert back then, right? It was humid, it was wet. So what little iron, or maybe not a little, but what iron might have been produced by pre-dynastic Egyptians, you're not going to find. It's going to be recycled, or it's just going to be rusted away. So the fact that we find this copper plate, really, really hugely significant, or iron plate rather. And to further support this idea of iron production in pre-dynastic times, you have these tunnels that run directly beneath the Giza causeway for, I forget which pyramid specifically it is. But these tunnels almost certainly predate the pyramids themselves, and predate the causeway, obviously, itself. And these tunnels are following iron ore veins. There's a not in ridiculously massive, but like pretty extensive tunnel network beneath the Giza plateau that is following iron ore veins. Now, could this have been mining iron oxide for a purpose different than iron production? Totally possible. But I think it's also entirely possible, especially with the existence, the knowledge that they were producing meteoric iron, that they were mining and smelting iron in pre-dynastic Egypt, and those tunnels are evidence of that. And like, if you have the meteoric iron, you recognize its valuableness, and these iron oxide veins are very much like right under the surface of the Giza plateau. Like, some of it is on the surface of the Giza plateau. And so and this is purely speculation. I haven't even looked into this to see how plausible or not it is, but imagine you have like a lightning strike this iron oxide vein, turn it into a bit of iron, and you go, hey, this is similar to that meteoric iron, right? And you put two and two together, you start mining it, you start smelting it. I think that's entirely possible. And then again, with the debate on the vases, is iron required to create that precision? Probably arsenical bronze is fine, but not wood, not copper. Bronze at the minimum, potentially iron. And, for a very long time, the Giza plateau and pre-dynastic Egyptians have kind of been almost mutually exclusive, right? You have the Giza plateau, which is prime real estate, right? It's right there along the Nile. It's where people would be if they were in that area, right? And yet, because archaeologists don't find much evidence of pre-dynastic Egyptians on the Giza plateau, they kind of like just ignore them and act like they weren't there. And it makes perfect sense that you don't find a lot of evidence of pre-dynastic Egyptians on the Giza plateau because it's been highly occupied in a highly active site. Again, it is prime real estate for the last 6,000 years after the pre-dynastic Egyptians. So what is there has largely been erased. It's been covered up. It's been removed. It's been destroyed. And that brings me to my next points, which is the megalithic constructions of the pre-dynastic Egyptians, because while we know they were making some grand mud brick palaces and they were working hard stone with the vases, they definitely weren't doing anything megalithic, right? Like they weren't working with big stones, except they were. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest this. So in the recent, let me pull up another window here. In the recent, if I can figure out how to share my screen. In a very recent video from Matt, Ancient Architects, he presented, let's see, that's not the right. It looks, that's right, I had to restart the computer. I don't even have the window open right now, so I don't even have the screenshot to show you. Maybe I'll pull it up, maybe I won't. It'll take me a minute if I do. Let me pull it up, fuck me. Okay, it's open. So in his recent video, though, he's discussing this large stone wall that existed on the Giza plateau that no longer exists. It's very small portions of it. I can't find the image. Forget it. You'll just have to listen. But if you watch his recent video, there was this natural stone wall that went across the Giza plateau. And only a few small portions of it are left now in the tomb of Khentkawis and the tomb of Kai. But on both the tomb of Kai and the tomb of Khentkawis is the palace facade. That's what it's known in recent times, which is just a design, right? And it's been dubbed the palace facade because it's been found on the exteriors of palaces and like royal burials, very important places, right? And so you have this giant wall stretching across the Giza plateau that assumedly the entire thing was covered in this palace facade. Again, we only have these two little points that are, separated, but we can see where the rock formation used to be and has since been quarried by the dynastic Egyptians. And that's megalithic right there. That's undoubtedly megalithic right there, carving this massive rock wall into this palace facade. But also, it is the palace facade. Like, does it make much sense that the pre-dynastic Egyptians just carved this wall to be covered in this palace facade? Or was this part of a grander structure, of a palace, of a fortress? And I think that makes a lot more sense, frankly. I think this was, yes, a palace facade, a palace wall that was carved into this rock, but that was just a part of the structure. Almost entirely that wall is gone now. Whatever else would have been built there has been, cannibalized, just like we constantly see throughout history. It's been quarried by the later dynastic Egyptians and reused and completely erased. But whether it had been accompanied by mud brick or other megaliths, I don't know, because it's all gone. But I think it's pretty clear that it probably wasn't just a wall that they decided to carve. It probably was part of a much grander structure, and this wall is pretty massive. Again, watch the Ancient Architects video for more information about that. It's linked down below. And on top of that, you have the Osirion, which I provided several links down below about people, both scholarly and alternate, discussing its much more ancient origins than Seti, which I think is like 3,000 years ago. So this wasn't even early dynastic. But Seti built his temple, and he built right below it the Osirion, which is this deep underground structure that baffles people, because how it was even created is a mystery, because how do you manage the water? It's all full of water. It's below the water line. And it's these extremely impressive megalithic blocks, which I have a couple pictures here to show you of just what I'm talking about here. That's the Osirion from above. I had to restart my computer right before all of this, and so not quite as organized as I wish I was. Here's an actual image of the Osirion. You can see the water in it. I believe right behind this picture is the Seti Temple, or what was the Seti Temple. And there's a lot of discussion about how Seti did build some of this, but the base of it and the origins of it are pretty clearly not 3,000 years old, but much older. There's erosion mismatches for the lower levels. The lower levels are much more eroded than the upper levels. The complexity, the fact that Seti didn't build anything else with these massive megalithic granite blocks during his reign, or subsequent reigns and previous reigns. Like, there's nothing else like the Osirion in that time period from Egypt. And so the alternate people love to go to, well, yeah, that's means it's 12,000 years old, obviously. And I've rallied against that from the start of this show. I think that the mainstream narrative is broken. And I think that a lot of this stuff probably is older than it's given credit for. But I think it's pretty illogical to just jump back to 12,000 years. Like, what of the thousands of years in between? And now that we're seeing evidence of the pre-dynastics achieving way more, I've barely scratched the surface. There's so much more to come. Achieving way more, not only than they were believed to achieve, but even than the dynastic Egyptians achieved. I think placing this as pre-dynastic makes a lot more sense. You also have the Djoser pyramid, right? Let's go to the Sphinx next, right? Of course, there's tons of debate about the older origins of the Sphinx as well. And the thing with the Sphinx is that, like, there's like a dozen different arguments all coming from a different direction, like, completely mutually exclusive of each other for why the Sphinx is older than Khufu. And so again, that is megalithic work. There's megalithic quarrying for the enclosure of the Sphinx. There's the megalithic construction of the Sphinx. And yeah, I think it's very obvious that work on the Sphinx started long before Khufu. And again, rather than going back 12,000 years, I think pre-dynastic makes a lot of sense. And again, I've provided some links down below for arguments on the Sphinx. I'm not going to go into every one of them because, again, there's like a dozen different arguments, but they all converge on the idea that the Sphinx has older origins than Khufu. And then you have Djoser. Djoser predates Khufu. He's a few, kings before Khufu. He builds the first pyramid on the Giza plateau. He builds the step pyramid. And there's a lot of ideas I'm trying to tie together here. So Khufu built his pyramid on what is accepted widely in Egyptology on a sacred site. He built it on an already pre-existing sacred mound and potentially pre-existing structure that was built by the pre-dynastics. The extent of that structure, the extent of the building before Khufu arrived, that's what's debated, but it's really pretty widely accepted that, like, this was a sacred site that already had something there. It is like the most prime real estate on the Giza plateau, right? And so why would the first king to build a pyramid not build it where Khufu built it, right? And I think there's a few reasons for this. One, because something was already there, but also I think there was something already there where Djoser built his pyramid. Underneath Djoser's step pyramid are 7 kilometers at least, because we haven't fully mapped them. We haven't fully excavated them. We haven't even fully, scanned to see what's there. But there is at least 7 kilometers of tunnels beneath the step pyramid, which I had something pulled up for that. I think I lost that in the restart as well. Um, that is not found underneath any of the other pyramids. There's underground works all over the Giza plateau, but like this is extremely extensive. It's extremely complex. It doesn't match any of the other pyramids. And you also have Djoser rounding up all of the vases from pre-dynastic Egypt and burying them in the tens of thousands beneath his pyramid. This has always stood out to me as a very interesting thing. It seems as if Djoser was trying to erase the grandeur of the civilization that came before them, because as I've started to point out, and as I'll continue to point out, the pre-dynastics achieved a lot of things that the early dynastics just couldn't replicate, like the vases. And so I wonder if Djoser didn't construct those tunnels, but was covering up those tunnels and using those tunnels to bury other evidence of this more advanced past that they couldn't replicate. And this was like a major shift in Egypt and the way it operated with Djoser. This was kind of like the concretion of this centralized Egyptian power, and the concretion of like a shift from, kind of nomadic people and whatever else to like mass produced grain, mass organized projects for things like pyramids. And yeah, as well as, the Great Pyramid having these older origins, I think that a lot of the underground structures on the Giza plateau are quite potentially pre-dynastic. I already discussed the tunnels mining the ore, the iron ore, and what would be left of pre-dynastic buildings on the Giza plateau? Nothing. I already discussed that with the wall, right, and how it's almost entirely erased, that natural escarpment. And so really the only evidence of like these megalithic constructions from the pre-dynastics that you would find would be what you find underground, like the Osirion, like the Osiris shaft that is allegedly Seti's. And so I think a lot of these, I think we have to take a new look, particularly at these underground structures in Giza, and reevaluate them through the lens of, could these be pre-dynastic? I know, Ben likes to talk about the what are those giant granite boxes in the, I'm blanking on the name, but you guys probably know what I'm talking about, those underground tunnels with the giant granite boxes that Ben loves to talk about, and he goes, they're 12,000 years old. Well, what if they're 6,000 years old, right? So I think we need to reevaluate these underground structures through that new lens of potentially pre-dynastic. Going back to some of the technologies that the pre-dynastics achieved that the early dynastic and even sometimes, later dynastics don't achieve for hundreds, if not 1,000+ years. They had lathes. They obviously had lathes. They had industrialized production with the vases. They had potter's wheels, which they also have connections with Mesopotamia, with Sumeria, which were largely overlooked and denied by mainstream academia, but have now started to gain some recognition. So could, the potter's wheel come from Mesopotamia? Potentially. Could the lathe come from Mesopotamia? I think it also could work the other way around, or even a third option, that it originates from somewhere else entirely. Like we have a copper production recently discovered at Göbekli Tepe. This whole narrative of gradual progressivism where everything has to work linearly, where, you go from hunter-gatherer to agriculture to stoneworking to pottery to whatever. And I'm not even saying that in the right order, but like, you know what I'm saying? This progressivism, I think, really needs to be thrown out. You have copper production 12,000 years ago at Göbekli Tepe. You have, lathes in dynastic Egypt. Like, are these ideas that are in existence for thousands of years that are then reaching Egypt somehow through Mesopotamia or through some other connection? Are they being independently created in Egypt as well? I think that's entirely, all of those are very possible. But most importantly, like, this gradual linear progressivism needs to be discarded. It's just not how things work. There are leaps that are made, like the Antikythera mechanism. There's so many examples of this throughout history, of technology springing up incongruously, with this idea of this linear progressionism. And then it's lost very easily. I talk about this a lot on the show. People drastically underestimate the power of destruction of nature, of time, of humanity. Things are lost very easily. Stradivarius violins, the finest violins in the world, right? We have no idea still how they were made. We have no idea what techniques went into making them. We just know they're the best. And that's because it was a singular family that held these techniques, that knew how to make these things. And when everyone who knew how to make them died off, so did the knowledge. So this knowledge getting lost between pre-dynastic Egypt to dynastic times is no mystery to me. But they had large-scale copper and bronze production with very low impurities. They had potter's wheels. They had lathes. They had iron production. They had, even my notes, I made like a list of bullet points to try and organize my thoughts here. And like, even that was multiple pages long. So I'm looking for the list of technologies that they had developed that don't exist in dynastic Egypt for a while. And I'm struggling because it's too much to scan quickly. More, they had bow drills. They had incredibly impressive pottery. Their black-topped redware pottery, which was made with potter's wheels, which again don't exist in early dynastic Egypt. Like, if you've never seen this stuff, I encourage you to look up the black-topped redware pottery of the Nikeda culture. Like, I think everyone would be like, that would be sick to have in my kitchen. Like, that's beautiful pottery. It takes quite a bit of technique and knowledge, and like, creating these things is far more complicated than just creating a normal pot. It really, a lot of understanding of chemistry and things like that has to go into creating this black-topped redware, especially with the consistency and the quality that we see coming from Nikeda. We have industrialization through the vases. Yeah. More evidence for activity, because again, the mainstream kind of views like predynastic and the Giza plateau is mutually exclusive, and more evidence that there was existing work with the pyramids on the Giza plateau is that at the very base of some of the pyramids, Maadi, which I believe is before Nikeda, Maadi pottery was found at the bases of the pyramids on the dynastic, or on the Giza plateau, which again indicates that at the very least there was activity there. There were people living there, but I think probably also indicates that they were constructing on that sacred mound site, that the Great Pyramid had foundations that were laid by the pre-dynastics. Not that Khufu didn't build it, but that the foundations were laid. Similarly with the Sphinx, he probably created that head, but there was clearly something there before Khufu ever got there. Sorry, I'm scanning my notes because there's a lot. If the pre-dynastics are responsible for the Osiris shaft, the Osirion, again, we're looking at like true megalithic construction, massive 100-ton granite blocks that are created with precision. Similarly, with the tunnels underneath Djoser's pyramid, there's massive megalithic blocks down there. There's, quite a bit of work down there. And I think Djoser did a lot of that. Like the tunnels are lined in faience and Egyptian blue and white Chura limestone and stuff. And a lot of that could have been and likely was Djoser, but the tunnels themselves, that massive megalithic granite construction, very deep underground, I think very possibly is predynastic. That giant escarpment that is only a part of what I believe to be a much grander structure. We're looking at a predynastic civilization that is very possibly, extremely megalithic, like on the same scale, if not even more impressive than what the dynastics were achieving. And again, this is coming from a proto-civilization. This is coming from a civilization that people debate whether it was even a true civilization. They were still doing a lot of hunting, a lot of nomading, if you will. They weren't just like mass producing fields and fields of grain and living in their house for their entire life, according to the mainstream, which I'm trying to throw away the mainstream. So I don't know how productive that is, but and the timeless texts video, which I linked down below in my description, it is not so much talking directly about Egypt, but it is talking about how the ancient world was clearly far more interconnected. I think I linked 2 of his videos. Far more interconnected than the mainstream accepts. The mainstream has this kind of really ridiculous position of, all these cultures were doing the same things. They have like extreme crossover on their religions. They were producing things very similarly, but there was no contact. It's all just coincidence. And he's breaking this down with a hell of a lot of evidence. His videos are extremely high quality. I highly recommend his channel, showing that, like these ideas spread even when populations don't. The technologies spread even when populations don't. And that like they're obviously, this isn't just like a conclusion he draws. He truly has very strong evidence for this. I'm just not going to go into all of it here. You watch his video for that. But that, these, you don't necessarily see these DNA shifts. Excuse me. You don't like see one population coming in and replacing another or even mixing with them. Yet you see the undeniable cultural influence being shared across these populations while they maintain their own genetic isolation. And so, similarly to what I was talking about before, is where there's connections through DNA and through other means of Sumeria and Egypt being in contact and sharing technologies in pre-dynastic times. I think it's entirely possible that there was widespread sharing of knowledge and preservation of more ancient knowledge, things that have carried over. And so, whether the pre-dynastics developed all of this technology like iron, copper, bronze, lathes, industrialization, etc., on their own, or whether it was shared with them, I don't know. But I do believe these things are pre-dynastic. They're not 12,000 years old, and they're obviously not dynastic because they're at least pre-dynastic, if not older. Less than 10% of Giza has been excavated. It's been occupied and highly developed over and over and over again for 6,000 years. So trying to find this direct evidence on the Giza plateau is limited, and it's difficult, and it's open to interpretation, whether you want to believe that the Osirion truly is from Seti or if it's older. But I think just in this little bit that I've presented so far, I've given pretty compelling arguments that the pre-dynastics were doing a lot on the Giza plateau, and they were doing a lot more than they're given credit for. I am going to revisit this topic and discuss this further, because not only is this like some of this information is very recent. Some of this just came out in the last couple weeks, pretty much. Um, Much of it, most of it is new to me. Most of it I've just been introduced to in the last couple of weeks. And I'm truly overwhelmed with the amount of information that is supporting this argument. And I haven't been able to present all of it properly because I'm just a bit overwhelmed trying to take it all in at the moment. Uh, but I think I've laid a decent foundation that I can come back and visit later and expand upon, because it's not just these facts. It's like the broader picture and the broader implication, like the things I was talking about with Djoser. Like, was he trying to erase the grandeur of the pre-dynastics before him? I think there's a very compelling argument to be made there with him rounding up tens of thousands of pre-dynastic vases and burying them deep, deep in these tunnels under his pyramid. I think the tunnels predating his pyramid, him building his pyramid on that location, ignoring the Great Pyramid's location, right? Because he was, again, trying to cover up and hide away and shift from, like, because that can be potentially an existential threat, right? Like, you are trying to establish the greatest kingdom in the world. You are trying to establish that you are a god king that, has absolute power and control and authority, and that you're the greatest thing ever. And yet you have all of this evidence of these people before you that you may or may not know much about, doing things that you simply can't do, that you simply can't achieve and recreate, and much less surpass, right? And so I think, and again, Djoser is like one of the most major shifting points into this god king Egyptian, version, that like the Egypt that we all know, that we've all learned about. Like, Djoser created that, and so I think, again, I'm overwhelmed, but like there's a lot of connections and ideas that have been spinning around in my head, along those lines, where it's like you don't just look at the facts. You also have to go, okay, what do these facts mean? What broader implications can be drawn from this? And even more broadly speaking, those timeless text videos, the two that I linked down below, are extremely high quality. They're also very significantly rewriting our understanding of history. Göbekli Tepe, with its copper production 12,000 years ago, it's hunter-gatherers creating these massive megaliths. Like, all of this is dismantling this narrative that's been established and building the foundation for a new narrative to be established, creating an environment in where we can acknowledge that, like, technology doesn't develop linearly. It makes leaps all the time, and it also gets lost all the time, and that our world was vastly more interconnected than previously believed. The old world to the new world, China to Egypt, like all of these various connections that were happening. I think Timeless Text does a fantastic job of laying out how, for tens of thousands of years, the world was very interconnected. The world was sharing ideas. The world was preserving ideas, and this goes along with all of this, to again, build up a new foundation for a new narrative to be established. Taking a look at the chat. No. Do they? Do my glasses make me look like a weirdo? Maybe a nerd, but not a weirdo. No. You can't give off the wrong vibe to women. Yeah. I wish I'm divorced now, but I frequently told my ex-wife, maybe this is part of the reason why, that I love that dog more than her. I love that dog more than anything in the world. He's the best dog in the world. A deaf autistic pit bull, severely autistic pit bull, best dog in the world. Yes, and that thank you. That was a point that I actually wanted to make more directly, more clearly than I did. Is that we're dealing with such large spans of time. We're dealing with things so far removed from us. The Nikeda culture is like 6,000 years old. The Great Pyramid is 4,500 years old, and I think it's very easily lost that these things aren't just like directly next to each other in history. Well, this is predynastic and that's dynastic. So like they came right after each other, right? Um, no, we're dealing with very large spans of time here. I don't have the list in front of me conveniently, but I actually like wrote down the list of technology that predynastics had, and then I looked for like the earliest potential evidence of that same technology cropping up again in Egypt, in dynastic Egypt. And some of these things are separated by over 1,000 years, but all of them are separated by at least a few hundred years. So, these accomplishments by the pre-dynastics, it's not like one generation was making these vases and then the next generation was making the Great Pyramid. We're dealing with hundreds, if not 1,000+ years of separation here. So yes, it's a huge span of time. They're not right next to each other in history. There's plenty of time for things to get lost. Like you look at the Bronze Age collapse, and everyone acknowledges that the whole world collapsed all at once. There was a massive technological and decrease in just everything, quality of life, all of it. This massive collapse. We don't even know why, right? Like there's no agreed upon answer for why the Bronze Age collapse happened. So, you don't need these like grand cataclysms like this 12,000-year-old cataclysm of a great flood to erase technology, to erase progress, to set things back. There's more than enough time for that to happen between the pre-dynastics and the dynastics. But even without any type of cataclysm, the Stradivarius family died. We don't know how to make Stradivarius violins anymore. Like that's very normal. And even with the industrialization of the vases, which I'm describing a fairly large scale operation here, it doesn't have to involve thousands of people. And even if it does, like the people operating the machines don't have to know how to create the machines, right? So like just imagine you do have this industrialized vase production and a flood comes in or a fire or whatever and totally devastates these industrialized vase production. There might have only been a handful of people, a few people who actually would have the know-how to recreate that. And depending on these vases were also produced for a long time. So like, it's not even unthinkable that someone created this technology, people continued utilizing this technology, and then by the time whatever happens to stop the usage of it, whether it be a flood, a fire, or just wear and tear or whatever, that like no one even knows how to recreate it. Even the people who are utilizing it might not know how to recreate this technology, especially if it's requiring things like iron or even just the arsenical bronze. So yeah, it's a large span of time, plenty of time and opportunity for technology to be lost. Excellent point there. Excellent point. I'm going back 6,000 years, roughly speaking, right? And maybe slightly beyond that, but like I'm not going back 12,000 years. That's one of my main disagreements. I obviously reject the mainstream narrative. I have so many problems with the mainstream narrative, but I also really reject the mainstream alternate narrative, which is this 12,000-year-old narrative. And I want to be clear. The arguments I'm making actually support that narrative in a way, right? Because I am talking about how easily things are lost and how rapidly technologies can develop. So the idea that there were lost civilizations doing grand things 12,000 years ago, I have absolutely no objections to that. I think it's entirely likely. And I think it's even entirely possible that some of the things we're looking at could be that old, like maybe the Osirion or whatever. But I think it's also a mistake to just blanketly label everything that doesn't conveniently fit into the mainstream narrative, which is a lot, as 12,000 years old. Like there's this like knee-jerk response from a lot of alternates to just go, oh, well, this doesn't fit into the mainstream, so it's 12,000 years old. And there's thousands, literally thousands of years in between 12,000 years old and wherever the mainstream places, whatever specific thing you're talking about, for some other civilization to do this. So, I think that broadly speaking, people in the ancient past were achieving far more than they're given credit for. They were developing technologies far more quickly and far more advanced than believed. And that these technologies were also getting lost all the time. That, like, we've gone through this many times. So I largely reject the 12,000 year narrative, but also am entirely in support of it. I just reject that, like, everything is 12,000 years old. I think some things could be. I think the vast majority probably isn't. So yeah, to answer that question. I mean, I wish. He's pretty cool. I like him a lot, even though I disagree with him. I'd love to have a fraction of his success. If only I could be Graham Hancock. Yeah, the underground. That's another thing that, moving away from Giza specifically, like almost every megalithic structure, or at least where you find like the most grand megalithic structures and a concentration of these megalithic structures, have very extensive underground networks. I mean, the tunnel network under the step pyramid, just as an example, can very easily and accurately be described as an underground city. It is massive, massive. And these underground networks very largely get overlooked. They just don't get discussed a lot. They don't get explored a lot. And there's a huge question of, like, why? Why were all of these things constructed? There's one specific tunnel in Giza, which, good luck finding references to this, but it does exist in an ancient architect's video somewhere. It's like 3/4 of a mile long, or it might be, it's a U shape. So it might be like a mile and a half long, but it's, 3/4 of a mile because it's doubled, if that makes sense. It connects to nothing. There's no other structure it connects to. It's just this U-shaped tunnel that's, extremely long, and it's entirely encased in fine white Chura limestone. No, there's no writing, there's no association with anyone or anything. There's no seeming purpose of this thing. It's just this very large, very carefully crafted tunnel underneath the Giza plateau. And so it's like, who did this and when? And so, yeah, I don't know why all of these underground structures were built. There's some speculation of, the sun butt fucks us every 12,000 years. And so, like, there's this ancestral memory of, the sky becoming your enemy, becoming Armageddon. And so what do? You start going underground, which I think is very possible, but I really can't tell you why or when all of these underground structures were built, but I can tell you that they are vast, they are numerous, and they exist in almost every major megalithic site around the world. Again, there's connection there, right? Like, just like with the nubs, we don't even know what the nubs are for, but they're found on like every single megalithic site around the world. There's obviously connections, large connections, that we still haven't made sense of. There's a lot of work to be done to continue building this foundation for rewriting history, but I think we're finally starting to get some major building blocks here. I'm not in danger. Yeah, I'm sure the water levels fluctuate, but it is always full of water. It's never been emptied, and they actually tried to pump it empty at one point, and I forget how big these pumps were, but like, these were some serious water pumps, and it would lower to a certain level, and then it just wouldn't go any lower. So, like, there's a very large, source of water feeding into the Osirion. So yes, I'm sure the water level fluctuates, but like, there's a certain level where it just doesn't go below that. And we've never in modern times seen it below that. Serapeum, yes, that is what I was referencing earlier with the giant granite boxes. Thank you. I struggle a lot with proper nouns. Yeah, I'm familiar with flamenco, and I don't, I'm pretty on board. I'm not entirely convinced that it's absolutely right, but like I'm pretty on board with the idea of major cataclysms happening 12,000 years ago and them being related to the sun. We seem to be very on track in our pretty imminent future, like the next couple decades or even sooner, of potentially suffering another cataclysm from the sun. I don't know how much I agree with like the whole crustal shift stuff, but there is obvious evidence of pretty major world changes, cataclysms, if you will, with the younger Dryas. And I think pretty compelling evidence that at least partially that was driven by the sun. So yeah, I'm familiar with flamenco, and it's very interesting. And I think he's basically on the right track, but I'm not fully sold on the degree. I think the world is far more cataclysmic than the mainstream narrative, but I don't know if I go fully to flamenco's level. Okay. Well, Nick Mullen. Okay. That's good for you. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and conclude this episode. I will be revisiting this topic later, because again, there is I'm mentally overwhelmed with all the information and all the research and all the speculation, all the connections that I'm trying to draw. So I'm going to revisit this at a later time. But my next video is probably going to be another Politigoob video. So this channel has been split into two topics. I talk about ancient history, and now I talk about politics. So if you were here for the politics, hope you enjoyed the ancient history. And if you're here for the ancient history, maybe consider checking out my political takes. But I'll be back with more on this, and more recently than that, I will be back with some political takes. So catch you guys later. Thanks for tuning in, and peace out, fellas.